Today, I want to share with you a story about the kind of strength that doesn't scream. It's a story about the difference between a house and a home, and the terrifying, beautiful moment when two lonely people realize they don't have to carry the weight of the world entirely on their own. It begins in the Arizona Territory. The year is 1884. And if you were to stand still in the middle of the Red Rock waystation, the first thing you would notice is the sound. It wasn't the sound of civilization. It was the wind. It moved through the canyon like a mournful ghost, scraping against the sandstone cliffs, carrying with it the relentless grit that found its way into your clothes, your food, and eventually, your soul. The heat here wasn't just a temperature. It was a physical weight. It pressed down on the roof of the waystation, baking the adobe walls until they radiated heat long after the sun went down. The air smelled of sagebrush burnt crisp by the sun, old, leather, and the sour, metallic tang of dried sweat. And in the center of this harsh, unforgiving landscape, there was Clara. If you looked at Clara Miller, you might miss the steel in her spine because of the exhaustion in her eyes. She was a woman in her mid-40s, though the sun and the sorrow had etched finer lines around her mouth than her years should have allowed. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had come west with a husband who promised her a garden and a future. But the fever took him in the first winter, and Silas Thorne took everything else in the second. On this particular Tuesday, the sun was at its zenith, bleaching the world into shades of blinding white and brown. Clara was down by the creek bed, which was more bed than creek these days, struggling with a rusted water barrel. It was a job for two men, maybe a mule, but Clara was doing it alone. She gripped the rough iron rim, her fingers wrapped in rags to stop the blistering, and heaved. Her boots slipped in the dry dust. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps that burned her throat. Every muscle in her back screamed in protest. A chorus of aches she had learned to ignore 3 years ago. She was working off a debt. That's what Silas Thorne called it. A debt for her husband's burial. A debt for her room. A debt for the food she ate. But Clara was smart enough to know that this debt was a living thing. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how many barrels she hauled or floors she scrubbed, the numbers in Thorne's ledger never went down. She was trapped, not by bars, but by a piece of paper and the miles of empty desert that surrounded her on all sides. She managed to get the barrel onto the cart, leaning her forehead against the warm wood for just a moment. Closing her eyes, she didn't pray. She had stopped praying for rescue a long time ago. She just breathed, gathering the pieces of herself back together, forcing her legs to straighten. Survival, she had learned, was just the stubborn refusal to sit down. That was when the silence changed. The usual noise of the waystation, the cursing of the hands, the clatter of pans, the braying of mules suddenly evaporated. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara wiped the sweat from her eyes and looked toward the horizon. A rider was approaching. Most men rode into the station with noise spurring their horses, shouting for whiskey, announcing their arrival like they owned the dust they kicked up. This man was different. He rode with a terrifying stillness. He moved with the land, not against it. As he drew closer, the details sharpened, but the mystery only deepened. He was riding a massive bay gelding that looked as road-weary as he was. The man wore a duster coat, faded to the color of dried tobacco, and beneath the brim of his hat, his face was a map of shadows. He was dark, his skin bearing the unmistakable heritage of the Apache and the Mexican borderlands. A scar ran jagged down the left side of his jaw, vanishing into his collar. He didn't look at the hands, watching him from the porch men who usually offered a sneer or a threat to strangers. He didn't look at the gun belts they adjusted nervously. He simply pulled his horse to a stop near the water trough. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy, solid thud. This was Gabriel Vega. They called him Wolf in the territories further south. But here, he was just a threat wrapped in silence. Clara watched him from the safety of the cart. She saw the way he checked his horse's hooves before he even dusted himself off. She saw that he carried a rifle, but he didn't flaunt it. He held himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knows exactly what he is capable of, and therefore has nothing to prove. Silas Thorne stepped out onto the porch then, wiping his greasy hands on a pristine white towel. Thorne was a soft man in a hard country, a man who mistook cruelty for strength. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It never did. "Water's 2 cents. Thorne called out, his voice oily. "Grain is 5. Gabriel didn't look up. He just began to ladle water for his horse. "I'll take a sack of oats," he said. His voice was low, rough like gravel grinding together. "And water." Thorne descended the steps, followed by 2 of his hired thugs. He walked over to the grain scale on the side of the porch. He threw a sack on the hook. The metal groaned. Thorne tapped the sliding weight, moving it quickly, his body blocking the view. "That'll be $2, Thorne said. "Shortage in the east. Prices are up." It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. The price was double what it should be, and the sack on the scale was light. Gabriel stopped tending to his horse. He turned slowly. He walked toward the porch, his spurs jingling softly, a lonely, rhythmic sound. He stopped 3 feet from Thorne. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stared. He looked at the scale. Then he looked at Thorne. The silence that stretched between them was thick enough to choke on. The hired hands put their hands on their revolvers, waiting for the signal. Thorne's smile faltered, sweat beading on his upper lip. He was used to men arguing. He wasn't used to a man who looked at him like he was already dead. $2, Thorne repeated, though his voice cracked just a fraction. "Take it or leave it." "Drifta." Gabriel didn't blink. The violence in the air was static electricity, waiting for a spark. Clara didn't know why she moved. She should have stayed by the cart. She should have kept her head down, finished her work, and survived another day. But she looked at the exhaustion in the stranger's shoulders. She looked at the arrogance on Thorne's face, the same face that told her every month that she hadn't worked hard enough. Something in her chest, something she thought had broken years ago, flared hot. She walked forward. Her boots crunched on the gravel, drawing every eye. "The scale is off." "Silas," she said. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop walking. Thorne spun around, his face twisting into a snarl. "Get back to work." "Clara, it's stuck," she said, louder this time. She walked right past the hired hands, right into the danger zone between the 2 men. She reached out with a trembling hand and slapped the side of the metal scale mechanism. Clang! The counterweight dropped. The needle swung wildly before settling. It settled 5 pounds heavier than it had shown a moment before. "There," Clara said, breathless. She didn't look at Thorne. She couldn't bear to see the rage she knew was coming later. She looked at the grain. It was just stuck. The dust gets in the gears. The lie hung in the air, fragile as glass. She had given Thorn a way to save face, by blaming the dust, but she had also stripped him of his power. Thorn stared at her, his jaw working. He looked at Gabriel, who hadn't moved a muscle. He calculated the odds. He looked at the size of the stranger, the scars, the stillness. Dust. Thorn spat, forcing a laugh that sounded like dry leaves breaking. Damn dust gets into everything. $2 for the grain and a hot meal then. Fair is fair. He turned and stormed back into the house, the screen door slamming behind him like a gunshot. The hired hands shuffled, lost interest, and drifted away. Clara stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt dizzy. She turned to go back to her cart, to disappear before she could regret her bravery. "Ma'am," the word stopped her. It was deep and quiet. Clara turned. Gabriel was looking at her. For the first time, she saw his eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and piercing. He wasn't looking at her dress, or her hair, or the dirt on her face. He looked at her hands, still trembling at her sides. He looked at the dark, purple bruise blooming on her wrist, where she had slammed it against the barrel earlier. He looked up at her eyes, seeing the fear she was trying to hide and the exhaustion she couldn't. He didn't smile. He didn't say thank you. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate dip of his chin. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. Game, recognizing game. Survivor, recognizing survivor. He turned back to his horse. He should have mounted up. He had his grain. He had his water. The smart thing to do was to ride out before Thorn started drinking and remembered his anger. But Gabriel didn't reach for the stirrup. Instead, his hand went to the cinch. With a slow, decisive pull, he loosened the saddle. He pulled it from the horse's back and set it on the rail. He wasn't leaving. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She turned back to her heavy cart, to the rusted barrels and the unending work. But as she gripped the handle, the load felt just a fraction lighter. Because for the first time in 3 years, someone had really looked at her. And, for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't entirely alone in the dust. The next morning, the sun rose like a judgment, harsh and inevitable. Silas Thorn thought he had won. He had watched the stranger, Gabriel, loosen his saddle the day before, and assumed he was just another drifter looking for a handout. Another man to be used up and discarded like a spent casing. Thorn had a stallion in the back corral, a beast of an animal, dark as a bruise and twice as angry. He called it the Widowmaker. It had already broken the arm of one hand and the ribs of another. Thorn offered Gabriel a job with a smile that showed too many teeth break the horse. "And you can stay." He expected Gabriel to be trampled by noon. But Gabriel didn't fight the horse. He didn't shout. And he didn't use the whip. He simply walked into the corral and stood there. For 3 hours. He just stood in the center of the dust, letting the animals scream and stomp and charge. Gabriel didn't flinch. He waited until the horse's lungs were heaving, until the fear burned out and left only curiosity. By the time the dinner bell rang, Gabriel was running a hand down the stallion's neck, murmuring in a language the animal seemed to remember from a time before ropes. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her hands deep in dishwater. She saw the way Gabriel moved, efficient, careful, deliberate. He was a man who didn't waste motion. And, She would soon learn. He was a man who didn't waste words. He didn't speak to her that first week. Not really. But he began to speak to her in a different language, the language of hands. It started with the woodpile. The axe Clara used was an old, rusted thing with a handle that was splintering near the head. Every afternoon, under the brutal gaze of the 2 o'clock sun, she had to chop kindling for the cookstove. It was a battle. The blade was so dull it bounced off the mesquite logs rather than biting into them. Every swing jarred her shoulders, sending shockwaves of pain down her spine. It took her an hour to do what should have taken 20 minutes. On Thursday, the heat was particularly cruel. Clara was struggling, sweat stinging her eyes, fighting a knotty piece of pine that refused to split. Thorn yelled from the porch, demanding his coffee. She dropped the axe in frustration, wiping her dirty hands on her apron, and ran inside to serve him, leaving the pile unfinished. She was gone for maybe 15 minutes. When she returned to the yard, bracing herself for the rest of the chore, she stopped dead. The log she had been fighting was gone. In its place was a neat, symmetrical stack of kindling, piled with geometric precision. The ground around the chopping block had been swept clean of chips, and the axe, Clara walked over and picked it up. The handle had been wrapped in a strip of soft leather, covering the splinters. She ran her thumb along the blade and pulled it back with a hiss. It was razor sharp. It gleamed in the sunlight, a silver edge of perfection. Gabriel was nowhere to be seen. He was out in the far pasture, fixing a fence line, a silhouette against the red rocks. But the weight of the axe in her hand felt different now. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a mercy. She looked toward the pasture, her chest tight. No one had sharpened a blade for her in 5 years. No one had cared if her hands bled. The days turned into a rhythm of silent conversation. There was the step on the back porch, the third one down. It had been rotted through for a year. Clara tripped on it daily, jarring her knees, spilling water buckets. Thorn had laughed once when she fell, calling her clumsy. 2 days after the woodpile incident, Clara stepped out with a heavy basket of laundry, bracing herself to skip the third step. Her foot landed on something solid. She looked down. The rot was gone. A new plank, thick and smelling of fresh sap, had been hammered into place. It was sanded smooth so it wouldn't catch her skirt. It was such a small thing. A piece of wood, a nail. But to Clara, it felt like someone had built her a palace. Then came the food. Thorn fed his workers slop-watery beans and corn that tasted of mold. But one evening, Clara found a small bundle wrapped in broad leaves sitting on the windowsill of her tiny shack. Inside was roasted rabbit, seasoned with wild sage. Still warm, she ate it in the dark, tears finally leaking from her eyes, savoring the taste of meat that hadn't been boiled to gray mush. It tasted like dignity. It tasted like someone saying, "You deserve to be nourished." She didn't know how to thank him. To speak of it openly would be to endanger him. Thorn was a jealous, petty king who punished anything he didn't control. So, she thanked him in the only way she could. She darned the tear in his duster coat when it was left on the rail. She left an extra ladle of water in his bucket. A week passed before they truly spoke. It was late, the moon hanging heavy and yellow over the canyon walls. The air had finally cooled, and the crickets were singing their rhythmic, endless song. Clara had gone out to the corral to check the gate latch, which had been sticking. Gabriel was there. He was leaning against the fence, watching the horses, The dark stallion, the one that had wanted to kill him days ago, now stood, with its head resting near Gabriel's shoulder. Clara hesitated, the dry grass crunching beneath her boots. Gabriel didn't turn, but he stiffened slightly. He knew she was there. "You shouldn't be doing the heavy work," she said softly. It was a foolish thing to say he was hired for heavy work, but she didn't know how else to start. "With your shoulder?" She had noticed he favored his left side. An old injury, perhaps. Gabriel turned slowly. In the moonlight, the planes of his face were sharp. The scar on his jaw, a silver line. "The work is the work," he said. His voice was a low rumble, blending with the night. Clara stepped closer, gripping her shawl. "Why do you stay?" "Gabriel, you have a horse. You have skill. You could be anywhere but here." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with that same intense, unblinking gaze from the first day. He looked at the way she held herself, the fatigue she wore like a second skin. "I know what a debt looks like, Clara," he said. He used her name. It sounded strange and heavy on his tongue. "I owe him," Clara whispered, the shame of it burning her cheeks. "My husband, the burial, the supplies. Thorne keeps the ledger. I can't leave until it's clear." Gabriel pushed off the fence. He took a step toward her, closing the distance until she could smell the dust and horse and sage on him. "A debt paid is freedom," he said, his voice hard. "Not at her, but for her. But a debt faked is a chain." Clara blinked, her breath catching. "What do you mean?" "I saw his book," Gabriel said. "He adds to it when you aren't looking. He charges you for the rain and the air. You don't owe that man a copper cent." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected it, in the darkest parts of her mind. But to hear it spoken aloud, to have her reality validated by this man, shattered something inside her. She wasn't a debtor. She was a prisoner. "He'll never let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Men like him," Gabriel said, his eyes dark and unreadable, "only hold on to things that don't fight back." He didn't offer to rescue her then. He didn't make a grand promise. He just planted the seed of truth and let it take root. He turned back to the horses, leaving her standing in the moonlight with her world tilting on its axis. The tension between them shifted after that. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was an alliance. 2 nights later, the intimacy of their silence reached its breaking point. Clara came around the corner of the bunkhouse, carrying a lantern. She froze. Gabriel was at the water pump. He had stripped off his shirt to wash the day's grime from his skin. The water glistened on his back, running in rivulets down his spine. But it wasn't his strength that stopped her breath. It was the scars. His back was a tapestry of violence. Old lash marks, knife wounds, the jagged pucker of a bullet hole near his shoulder blade. It was a map of every time the world had tried to break him and failed. He heard her and straightened, water dripping from his hair. He didn't cover himself. He didn't shy away. He turned, water sluicing down his chest, and met her gaze. He was vulnerable in a way men like him never allowed themselves to be. Clara set the lantern down on a barrel. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw the bar of rough lye soap sitting on the edge of the trough, just out of his reach. Without a word, she walked forward. The air between them was thick, charged with a current that felt like the moment before a lightning strike. It wasn't sexual, not in the cheap, tawdry way Thorne looked at her. It was deeper. It was the recognition of one damaged soul calling out to another. She picked up the soap. Her hand trembled. Gabriel watched her. Water dripping from his chin. He didn't move. He let her come into his space. Clara held the soap out. He reached for it. For a heartbeat. Their fingers didn't touch. Just hovered there, occupying the same small space in the vast, empty night. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin. She could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of his throat. Then, his fingers brushed hers, rough skin against calloused skin. The contact was electric. A sudden, sharp jolt that made them both inhale sharply. He took the soap. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second too long. "Thank you," he murmured. "You missed a spot," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She gestured vaguely to the dust on his shoulder. Her courage failing her, she turned and fled back to the safety of the main house, her hand burning where he had touched it. But as she lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the wind, she didn't feel the crushing weight of the debt. She felt the ghost of his touch. And for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was waiting for what came next. The Arizona sky didn't warn you with clouds. It warned you with color. 3 days after the moment at the water pump, the horizon changed. The relentless blue that had bleached the territory for months suddenly bruised. It turned a sickly, stagnant purple, then a violent orange. The wind died completely. The silence that fell over the Red Rock waystation wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the world, leaving a vacuum waiting to be filled by something terrible. Gabriel was the first to stop working. He was out by the far paddock, mending a rail. He stood up, dropped his hammer, and looked south. Clara was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She saw him stop. She saw the way the horses in the corral suddenly bunched together, their ears pinned back, stamping the ground in a frantic, synchronized rhythm. Then she saw it. It looked like a mountain range moving across the desert floor. A wall of dust, thousands of feet high, rolling toward them. It wasn't just a storm. It was the earth itself rising up to swallow the sky. "Ahaboob, get inside." Gabriel's voice tore across the yard, louder than she had ever heard it. "Clara, get inside." But Clara didn't run for the main house. She looked toward the barn. The milk goats were tied out back, and the heavy wooden shutters on the stables were latched open to catch the breeze. If the storm hit with the force it promised, the roof would lift, and the animals inside would be torn apart by flying debris. She dropped the rug and ran, not toward safety, but toward the barn. Clara. Gabriel shouted again, but the wind took his voice. The first gust hit the station like a physical blow. It wasn't air. It was gravel and sand moving at 60 miles an hour. The world went from afternoon bright to twilight dark in a single heartbeat. Clara made it to the barn just as the sun vanished. She wrestled the heavy double doors shut, dropping the iron bar into place with a clang that was immediately swallowed by the roar outside. It sounded like a freight train was driving directly over the roof. The air inside instantly filled with fine, choking powder. The animals were screaming. The horses kicked at their stalls, the sound of wood splintering mixing with the howl of the wind. Clara grabbed a blanket and threw it over the head of the nearest mare, trying to calm her. "Easy," she choked out, coughing. "Easy now." Above her, the main beam of the barn groaned. It was an old sound, the sound of wood that had been dried to brittle bone by years of heat. The entire structure shuddered. Clara looked up, dust stinging her eyes. The roof shingles were ripping away, one by one, sounding like gunfire. Then, with a crack that vibrated in her teeth, a support beam snapped. A section of the loft collapsed, raining hay and heavy lumber down onto the stable floor. Clara scrambled back, tripping over a feed bucket. She fell hard into the straw, covering her head as debris crashed inches from her legs. She was trapped. The collapse had blocked the main doors. The wind was tearing the building apart, piece by piece. And she was curled in the corner of a horse stall, unable to see, unable to breathe. For the first time, terror didn't just touch her. It paralyzed her. She pressed her face into her knees, the roar of the storm erasing everything: her name, her past, her hope. Then, the side door burst open. It didn't open easily. It was kicked in. A figure appeared in the swirling gray darkness. He was wrapped in a scarf, bent double against the wind that tried to shove him back out. Gabriel. He didn't call her name. He didn't need to. He scanned the chaos, his eyes narrowing until they locked onto her huddled form in the corner. He crossed the distance in 3 strides. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. There was no time for that. Another beam cracked above them, dangling precariously. Gabriel dropped to his knees and pulled her out of the corner, dragging her under the heavy oak workbench against the far wall. It was the only solid thing left. He shoved her deep into the shadows beneath the bench, and then he crawled in after her. There wasn't enough room. He had to curve his large frame around hers. He pulled the heavy canvas duster coat over both of them, creating a tiny, sealed cocoon against the chaos. And then, the roof let go. A massive section of the barn ceiling crashed down. It slammed into the workbench above them, shaking the ground. Dust exploded around them, thick and suffocating. But nothing touched Clara. Gabriel had braced himself over her, his arms locked, his body a human shield. She felt the impact shudder through him. She heard him grunt, a sharp exhalation of pain. But he didn't collapse. He held the weight. They lay there in the dark, pressed together in a space no wider than a coffin. The storm raged outside, screaming like a banshee. But under the bench, the world had shrunk to the sound of 2 hearts beating frantically. Clara was shaking, violent, uncontrollable tremors. She gripped the front of Gabriel's shirt, her knuckles white. She buried her face in his chest, smelling the dust and the rain that hadn't fallen yet, and the warm, solid scent of him. "I've got you," he said. His voice was right at her ear, low and steady. "I've got you. Clara, breathe." She gasped for air, choking on a sob. I thought this was it." "No," he said firmly. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, pressing her closer to him, protecting her from the dust. "Not today." Time lost its meaning. It might have been an hour. It might have been 5 minutes. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a terrifying intimacy. They were tangled together, legs interlocked, his chest rising and falling against hers. "I hate this place," Clara whispered. The confession spilled out of her, raw and unbidden. "I hate the dust. I hate that it covers everything. If I died here, Gabriel, the dust would just cover me up. In a week, no one would know I was ever here." She pulled back just enough to look at him in the gloom. Her eyes were wide, rimmed with tears that made tracks through the grime on her face. I'd just be a bump in the ground. Forgotten, Gabriel looked at her. In the darkness, his eyes were fierce. He shifted his weight, wincing slightly from where the debris had struck his back. But he didn't let go of her. He reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His thumb was rough, calloused, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. Not forgotten, he said. It wasn't a comfort. It was a vow. Not by me. Not here. The words hung between them, heavier than the storm. He was telling her that she existed, that she mattered, that even if the earth swallowed the station whole, he would know where she was. Clara let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned back into him. For the first time in her life, she stopped fighting. She let him hold her. She let herself be weak. Because he was strong enough for both of them. Eventually, the screaming wind died down. The roar faded to a moan, and then to a whisper. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was the silence of aftermath. Gabriel moved first. He groaned as he shifted, pushing the debris away from the opening of their shelter. He crawled out, then reached back in, gripping Clara's hands to pull her into the gray light. The barn was a ruin. Sunlight streamed through gaping holes in the roof, illuminating the millions of dust motes dancing in the air. Everything was covered in a thick layer of brown powder. They looked like statues carved from the earth, two ghosts standing in the wreckage. "Are you hurt?" Gabriel asked, checking her arms, his hands lingering on her shoulders. "No," she said softly. "I'm fine. You saved me." Before he could answer, the stable doors, or what was left of them, creaked open. Silas Thorne stood in the opening. He was untouched. He had ridden out the storm in the root cellar of the main house with a bottle of whiskey. His clothes were clean. He looked at the collapsed roof. Then he looked at Gabriel and Clara. He saw the way they were standing. They weren't touching. Not anymore. But the space between them was charged. He saw the way Clara looked at Gabriel, not with fear, and not with the submissive exhaustion she showed Thorne. She looked at him with trust, and he saw the way Gabriel stood between Clara and the door. A protective stance. A claim. Thorne's face darkened. A cold, ugly sneer curled his lip. He didn't care about Clara, not really. He didn't love her. But he owned her. She was his mule, his cook, his debtor. And looking at them now, standing together in the dust, he realized something that terrified him more than the storm. He realized that the ledger didn't matter anymore. He realized that this drifter hadn't just broken his horse. He was stealing his property. "Get back to the house," Thorne barked, his voice tight with a jealousy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with power. "Fix this mess. Both of you." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching loudly on the broken wood. Clara flinched at the tone. Old habits dying hard. But Gabriel didn't look at Thorne. He kept his eyes on Clara. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll handle him." Clara looked at the door where Thorne had vanished, then back at Gabriel. The fear was still there. But beneath it, something new was growing. A tiny, fragile sunflower pushing up through the cracked earth. "Be careful, Gabriel," she whispered. "He sees it. He knows. Let him know," Gabriel said. And as he turned to start clearing the wreckage, Clara saw the set of his jaw. The storm was over. But the war had just begun. The storm had cleared the air of dust, but it left something heavier in its wake. The silence that settled over the Red Rock waystation that night wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. Silas Thorne sat in the main house, a bottle of whiskey uncorked on the table. The oil lamp cast long, flickering shadows that danced against the walls like nervous spirits. He was a man who understood leverage. And for the first time in years, he felt his leverage slipping. He had seen the way Clara looked at the drifter. He had seen the way the drifter stood between her and the wind. Thorne took a long drink, the liquor burning a path down his throat. He didn't want Clara not in the way a man wants a wife. He wanted her broken. He wanted her small. And she was standing tall again. That, he decided, had to end. "Clara," he bellowed. She came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked tired, but her chin was up. She didn't flinch at his tone anymore. That small act of defiance set Thorne's teeth on edge. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I have work to finish." "Silas," she said quietly. "The work is done," he said, his voice dropping to a slur. "I sold it." Clara froze. "You sold the grain?" Thorne smiled, a wet, cruel expression. "I sold the debt." "Your debt?" He leaned forward, the smell of whiskey rolling off him in waves. "I spoke to a man in Tucson. He runs a house for men who need company. He pays good money for women who know how to work hard." The room seemed to tilt. Clara gripped the back of the chair, her knuckles turning white. "You can't do that. That isn't the agreement. The agreement is whatever I say it is." Thorne slammed his hand on the table. "You leave in the morning. The wagon comes at dawn." Clara shook her head, terror warring with disbelief. She reached for the locket at her throat, her nervous habit, her anchor. It was a cheap silver thing, tarnished by sweat and time, holding the only picture of her late husband she had left. Thorne's eyes tracked the movement. He stood up, swaying slightly. "And that?" he sneered. "Payment for the interest." He moved faster than a drunk man should. He reached out and snatched the chain. Clara cried out, stumbling back, but the clasp snapped. Thorne held the locket up to the light, dangling it like a trophy. "Please," Clara begged, the dignity she had fought so hard to keep shattering. "Silas, please. It's all I have. You have nothing." Thorne hissed. He dropped the locket onto the hardwood floor. Then, staring right into her eyes, he brought his heavy boot down. There was a crunch of metal and glass. The sound was small, but in that quiet room, it sounded like the end of the world. Clara screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of grief, of rage, of a woman who had been pushed past the edge of endurance. It tore through the thin walls of the adobe house and echoed out into the yard. Gabriel heard it from the bunkhouse. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't pause to put on his boots. He moved with the instinct of a wolf that hears its pack in danger. He crossed the yard in seconds, the gravel cutting into his bare feet, a shadow moving against the darkness. Inside the house, Thorne laughed, grinding his heel into the floor. "Scream all you want," he said. "No one listens to." The front door didn't open. It exploded inward. Gabriel filled the frame. He took in the scene in a single heartbeat. Clara sobbing on the floor, the broken silver under Thorne's boot, the cruelty etched on Thorne's face. Thorne stumbled back, reaching for the drawer of the table. "You get out," he shouted, fumbling. "You get the hell out." He pulled out a revolver. The metal gleamed blue in the lamplight. Gabriel didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He charged. Thorn fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. Gabriel jerked back, his left shoulder exploding in a spray of red. But his momentum carried him forward. He didn't feel the pain. He only felt the rage. He collided with Thorn, slamming him into the wall. The gun clattered to the floor. Gabriel didn't go for it. He didn't need it. His knife was in his hand, a blade he used for skinning, for working, for surviving. He pinned Thorn against the plaster. The tip of the knife pressed hard against the soft flesh beneath Thorn's chin. Thorn froze, his eyes bulging. He could feel the cold steel. He could smell the copper scent of Gabriel's blood dripping onto his shirt. "You touch her," Gabriel growled. His voice, a low, terrifying rumble. "And I will carve you into pieces the coyotes won't touch." He pulled back his fist and drove it into Thorn's stomach, doubling him over. Then he hit him again. A brutal, efficient strike to the jaw that sent Thorn sprawling to the floor. Unconscious, before he hit the wood, Gabriel stood over him, chest heaving. The blood was soaking the entire left side of his shirt, dark and wet. His hand was shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline, the urge to finish it. He shifted the knife in his grip. One motion. That was all it would take. One slice, and the world would be rid of Silas Thorn. He took a step forward. "Gabriel." The voice was soft, trembling. He stopped. He didn't turn. His eyes were fixed on Thorn's throat. "Gabriel." "Stop." Clara was beside him now. She didn't look at Thorn. She reached out and placed her hand over Gabriel's, the hand holding the knife. Her fingers were warm. They were shaking, but they were strong. "He's done," she whispered. "Look at him. He's done. He'll come for you." Gabriel rasped, the words catching in his throat. "He won't stop. We won't be here," she said. She pressed closer, her other hand coming up to touch his face, turning him away from the violence. "Gabriel, look at me." He turned. His eyes were wild, dilated with pain and fury. "He isn't worth your soul," she said firmly. "Do not give him that. You've given him enough." The words cut through the red haze. "He isn't worth your soul." Gabriel blinked, the tension slowly bleeding out of his frame. He looked at the knife in his hand as if he had forgotten it was there. He looked at Clara, her face tear-streaked, but alive, safe. He sheathed the knife. "We go," he said. Now, they moved with desperate efficiency. There was no time to pack, no time to plan. Clara grabbed a shawl and a bag of dried meat. She didn't look at the broken locket on the floor. That life was gone. Gabriel led her out to the corral. His shoulder was burning now, a fire that threatened to drop him to his knees. But he set his jaw. He whistled low. The black stallion, the widowmaker, trotted over. The horse that had tried to kill every man who touched it stood still for Gabriel. He threw a blanket over its back. There was no time for a saddle. He helped Clara up, gritting his teeth as the movement pulled at his wound. Then he swung up behind her. "Hold on," he murmured. Clara wrapped her arms around the horse's neck. Leaning low, Gabriel wrapped his good arm around her waist. Locking them together, they didn't look back at the waystation. They didn't look back at the light spilling from the open door where a bad man lay bleeding. Gabriel kicked the stallion's flanks. The horse surged forward, powerful and fast, its hooves eating up the ground. They rode out of the yard, past the broken fence, past the dry creek bed, and into the vast, consuming dark of the canyon. Above them, the moon was hidden, leaving the world pitch black. But, for the first time, neither of them was afraid of the dark. They were together, and they were free. They rode until the horses were trembling, and the stars began to fade into the gray wash of dawn. They didn't stop when the sun came up, nor when the heat began to rise again. They rode until the red dust of the Arizona territory was nothing but a smear on the southern horizon. The journey wasn't easy. Freedom never is. It is a road paved with blisters and cold nights. For the first week, Gabriel burned with fever. The bullet wound in his shoulder was angry and deep. They camped in a dry wash near the border of Utah, under the shelter of a twisted juniper tree. Clara, the woman who had once been afraid to ask for a fair price on grain, became the healer. She boiled water over a smokeless fire. She cleaned the wound with the last of their whiskey. She tore her petticoats into bandages. When Gabriel tried to stand too soon, driven by the instinct to keep moving, she put a hand on his chest. "Rest," she told him. And for the first time in his life, the wolf listened. As the weeks turned into months, the land began to change. The oppressive flatlands gave way to rising slopes. The sagebrush turned to scrub oak, and the scrub oak gave way to towering pines that smelled of resin and clean air. The air grew thin and sharp. They stopped running away. Somewhere, in the high passes where the air was cold enough to see your breath, they started moving toward something. They found it in a valley in the Colorado mountains. It was a place the maps had forgotten. A bowl of green grass cupped by granite peaks that held the snow all year round. There was a creek there that ran clear and cold, singing a song much different than the mournful wind of the desert. "Here," Gabriel said. He slid off the stallion, wincing only slightly. He looked at the water, then at Clara. "We stop here." They built their life the way they had survived the storm together. They didn't start with a roof. They started with a hearth. Gabriel said that a fire needed a home before a man did. They spent days hauling river stones from the creek bed heavy, smooth, gray stones that had been shaped by the water for 1,000 years. Clara mixed the mud and mortar. Gabriel lifted the stones. They built a chimney, wide and solid. It rose from the earth like a promise. Wood could rot, wood could burn, but stone was an anchor. Stone meant you weren't leaving. When the last stone was placed, they stood back, their hands covered in earth, their clothes worn thin. Gabriel put his arm around her waist. He didn't say, "I love you." He said, "It will stand." And she knew it meant the same thing. Time in the mountains doesn't move in hours. It moves in seasons. The winters were deep and silent, burying the cabin in white. The springs were explosive, carpeted in wildflowers that turned the valley purple and gold. 10 years passed. If you were to ride into that valley today, you wouldn't see the frightened widow who hauled water barrels. You wouldn't see the drifter with the knife and the haunted eyes. You would see a boy, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. He is crouching in the tall grass, silent as a shadow. Beside him, Gabriel kneels, older now, the gray in his hair matching the scars on his face. He points to a track in the mud, a deer trail. He speaks in a whisper, teaching the boy the language of the land. He is patient. The violence that once lived in his hands has been replaced by a steady, guiding gentleness. And on the porch of the cabin, a cabin that now has a sturdy roof, and a garden full of sunflowers sits Clara. She is sitting in a rocking chair Gabriel carved for her. In her lap is a book. It's a simple thing, leather-bound and worn. But she is reading. In the middle of the afternoon, with the sun on her face. She is reading. It is a luxury she never dared to dream of in the dust of the waystation. She isn't worrying about a ledger. She isn't afraid of a footstep on the porch. She turns the page, and the sound is the loudest thing in the valley. She looks up. She sees her husband and her son coming back from the tree line. Gabriel catches her eye. He doesn't wave. He just nods, that same slow, deliberate nod from the first day they met. And Clara smiles. We are taught that love is a lightning strike. We are told it is diamonds and grand speeches and dramatic rescues. But the truth is much quieter. Love is the person who sharpens the axe, so your hands don't bleed. Love is the person who fixes the step you always trip on. Love is the person who stands over you in the dark, when the roof collapses and says, I've got you. They found that the quiet of the canyon was not empty. It was full of everything they had ever needed. And that, my friends, is where we leave Gabriel and Clara safe in the high ground, listening to the wind in the pines. Thank you for journeying with me today on Echoes of the West. I'd love to know what you're thinking right now. Did this story remind you of someone?